And so I think over time, just interests have drifted and shifted. And I think one of the most important things that was part of my early phase was trying to really understand cult dynamics, what people were calling cult dynamics or undue influence. And so trying to examine my own journey through that lens was an important dimension of my journey. But that gave me a sensitivity to when I see um, dogmatic ideology driving a particular issue. And so I think I started to see those sort of features show up in other more non-religious, culturally relevant aspects of our modern discourse. And so I started to look into that a little bit more, and I found there were some important and significant things to say about subjects beyond religion.
Many know who my guest is today. It's Jonathan Streeter. He has a YouTube channel, thoughts on things and stuff. I'll let you introduce yourself for people that maybe are unfamiliar.
Sure. Well, as she said, I have a YouTube channel, thoughts on things and stuff. That was kind of after I had a blog originally. That was the original thoughts on things and stuff. And in it, I originally just wanted to sort of document my own journey as I was processing and learning things. First as a Mormon, and I didn't really start writing for that till I'd already kind of gone through the journey of deciding that my membership in the church wasn't going to work out. But there was a lot of things that I encountered that I wanted to kind of blurt out onto a page to organize my own thoughts and to try to, I guess, get the validation of seeing if those thoughts meant anything to anybody else, because I certainly wasn't able to get any of that validation from my family members when I tried to talk to my brother. I had one brother in particular that tried to engage me in a lot of these things, but he came at it from a very I would see it as a closed mind. He would see it as a firm position in his convictions. And then that was kind of in the era of blogs. And then when the era of video came out, I transitioned to doing video stuff. And so I guess people have seen my own journey as they can see the different subjects that I've talked about and focused on over the years, and check it out.
Yeah. So timeline, how long when you started your blog?
Well, it was probably around 2014, 2015. I ended up resigning from the church in 2014 and was pretty active in writing content originally. And then, went through some bumps in my life and all these other things, and have settled into pretty much just doing things on my own schedule whenever things strike me and I have time enough to put them together.
Okay. Did you go through like a phase where you're like, this was what you were doing? You were consistently doing content and writing and stuff. And then you found other things that are important in your life, or are you still doing it? Like, how has your attention to this project come and gone?
I think early on, when you're in your angry phase, or when you're, you're really dealing with the aftermath in your family of the faith transition, then it's much more, front and center in my mind. And so that's when I would probably write or create content more. Over time, I think once you process certain things, then your interest in them wanes a little bit unless some new dimension comes out. And so I feel like I've gone through and seen enough and said enough, or maybe been exposed to enough on a lot of different things, that I don't really engage with it too much more. And so I think over time, just interests have drifted and shifted. And I think one of the most important things that was part of my early phase was trying to really understand cult dynamics, what people were calling cult dynamics or undue influence. And so trying to examine my own journey through that lens was an important dimension of my journey. but that gave me a sensitivity to when I see um, dogmatic ideology driving a particular issue. And so I think I started to see those sort of features show up in other more non-religious, culturally relevant aspects of our modern discourse. And so I started to look into that a little bit more, and I found there were some important and significant things to say about subjects beyond religion, and so I've kind of explored some of those things as well.
Yeah, I remember you had that project where you had a quiz for people to take.
Yeah.
Do you still keep that? I don't know, like, is it a website? Do you
It's a
still?
website. Yeah, I
Okay.
used it's like a platform where you can create a web application without having to know how to code. So I did that. It's isitculty.com. And that was, a lot of times you'll listen to former Jehovah's Witnesses, former Scientologists, and they'll just say, it's a cult, it's a cult. And they'll talk and they'll look at the things that their group does and they'll say, this is what cults do. And the challenge is that a lot of the things that they'll talk about you can find in organizations and in relationships that aren't cults, that we wouldn't see as cults. And so the question then becomes like, well, how useful is both this particular, you know, technique to identify a cult? How useful is the term cult? And it just ends up not being terribly useful, but there's still something there, even though you can't look at one little part and then immediately plaster the label over something. Then that's where I felt like doing something that was an assessment tool that allowed you to kind of grade an overall rating of it would be helpful. And I've after taking the work of other people like Luna Lindsay Corbin and John DeLynn, who did things in that direction before, and then just trying to make something that anyone could take for themselves. Um, I think it's been helpful and informative to look at different things through that lens and kind of remind you that you don't have to immediately run for the hills if you see some things that might match what cults do, because there's if you're in the military, if you're in a bunch of different things, you're going to find a lot of those elements there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a cult.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one project.
Okay. And I remember watching a stream a long time ago. You were saying that you're collecting the data and look like, are you able to see the back end data when people put in,
Yeah,
um,
it's
and like,
go
what
ahead.
was anything interesting there? I don't know. I don't know if you've ever talked
Well,
about that.
it's the plan was originally to get enough people submitting their own results, because you say, hey, we have a score now from 1 to 100 when somebody does Scientology or something. Well, that score doesn't actually mean anything, because we had Jacob Hansen do it on Mormonism. He got a particular score. It doesn't mean anything, but because nobody's going to call their own thing a cult. But if I believe in group A and I've gotten this score, but I, from group A's perspective, know that group B, C, and D are cults. If I can look at aggregate data of what people rate those things and then see that the score is not all that different from mine, then that might be a data point that there may be some room for introspection in my own perspective there. And that's something that I'm hoping at some point some spark will happen where I'll be motivated to aggregate and do something with that data. Right now it exists, and anyone that takes and finishes one of the inventories, I have their data for that. There's no identifying data. There's no
Right.
saved name or IP address, but I just have what their
That's just
score is.
the group and the score. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm
Um,
hopeful that that will be useful in the future sometime, but it's up and running.
I don't know. I think that if it's your group that has a high score, you would just say, well, all of those, it makes sense that they work like they're supposed to, but it's Satan's counterfeit over there, and mine's like the right one, right?
Yeah. I think that's a very common
Doesn't
impulse.
well, no, like I
And
remember thinking that. Like I remember thinking, like I could see the parallels, and that was the apologetic thing that either I was taught in seminary or I don't know, maybe I came up with it, but it worked
well,
well.
it's more than just an assessment. I think when you go through something like that, particularly in the different streams that I have, you're talking to somebody from one particular group, but then you're comparing it to other groups and how it manifests in those groups. And so for the person going through and taking the test, possibly being exposed to some of those concepts for the first time, it can actually be an education while they're doing it. And I think once you see some of those techniques employed in groups that you definitely don't have a positive sentiment towards, when it pops up again in your own group, it's going to rub you the wrong way. And I think like President Nelson's recent talk may have manifested that in the minds of some people who've been engaging in online discourse, defending the church, and then his talk comes out and it contains some of those same sort of things, and people are like, I don't know about that. But
you're gonna have to like. I haven't listened. I didn't listen to conference. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's a good milestone. The year where you don't care about conference again.
I'll tell you, the conferences I listened to the best were like the two right after like my collapse of belief. I never listened more intently because I was actually listening for a way for me to fit in. Like, and I didn't hear it. Like, I was like, oh, I found all this stuff up there, and it was like the 200th anniversary of the. It's always the 200th anniversary of something, but that particular one was of the first vision, and I was like, oh, they're gonna revise the first vision. This is gonna be a big deal. They're gonna actually incorporate all of the versions, and of course, it was just doubling down, and I was like, ugh. So, but yeah. Anyways, what was in President Nelson's talk that you were referring to?
Well, I mean, probably one of the most stereotypical cult techniques will be to define some great reward in the life hereafter, and then to set up a bunch of hoops and say the only way that you're going to get that great reward in the life hereafter is if you follow the hoops that we in particular have set up. And so they did kind of a two-pronged approach where they reaffirmed that concept that, yes, there are great blessings for you in the great beyond, but you have to do these things. We're not loosening up that. But on the other hand, they also said, but don't worry, like Mormon hell is not that bad. Like, if you don't live up to every rule and the rules you're comfortable living up to, well, your place, your kingdom in the life after is going to be where you feel most comfortable. So it's actually kind of good. It's like, you're living in an eternity where you have the PS4 and everybody else that did the right thing has the PS5, and that's cool. You still have the PlayStation 4, so you're good. And so I don't know. They're trying to find a middle way, it feels like, on that form of spiritual coercion. And people would say, well, that's not spiritual coercion. That's what religion's about. That's okay, but just go listen to some other religion define the great eternities in the hereafter, and then say you have to do what we say if you want this great blessing. And you're just like, well, that paradigm of how you assert control over people's lives it's kind of it's a subtle thing, because you set up these hoops, and it's a form of control because you say, if you want this eternal chocolate bar, you have to jump through our hoops. But it's up to you. If you want to rot in a lesser kingdom, that's up to you. And so they never told you what you had to do. They never said you had to do it, but they just kind of set up the system where if you didn't choose the right way to go, then you have it. It's cringy, because it feels like an outmoded religious paradigm, I guess. One of the things that was an important part of my own journey was when you're raised in the church and you conceptualize religion the way the church conceptualizes it to you, you get the idea that all these other churches have the same sort of hierarchy and the same polity and the same conception about authority and who they are and what they represent. And so you're like, oh, well, you assume that that's the way, a very concrete, literal faith is the type of faith that exists out in the wider spiritual world. And I think one of the educating aspects of being more informed about other spiritual paradigms is that is not, in fact, the way that every other religion is done. And there are many different types of polities, and there are many different conceptions of faith and the role that it plays in an individual's life, and many different ways of experiencing religious community and religious adherence and religious belief that aren't rooted in the concrete, literal, physical notions that Mormonism is founded on.
Right.
And so I guess being jolted back into that realm with Nelson's talk and things like that is, I guess that's why it rubbed me the wrong way.
Is that just one that you happened to review, or did you
Well,
listen to bits and pieces?
No, I think anytime there's a talk that generates a lot of response and reaction, then I get interested in, well, why is this? Why are people so eager to comment on this talk? And everyone, I think there's a part in it where he says, never listen to the counsel of the unbelievers or something like that. It's a very much us versus them type of move. And that one's an obvious problem with it, but there were a fair number of other issues in the talk. And I try to give the general authorities the benefit of the doubt. And I think there's a tendency in ex-Mormon content creators to dig through and identify the problematic parts and only look at the problematic parts. I've done this myself, but I think that seeing religion in sort of a different light as something that people can use to navigate difficulties in life, to do it justice, you kind of can go in and say, okay, well, we've talked about the bad, problematic parts about it. Now, what parts of the talk may actually be beneficial for someone, and at least give some acknowledgement of that aspect of it. So I haven't done that full analysis of that talk. I'm not sure if I'm going to do anything with that.
Yeah. I think there's some that would say that all religions are basically a cult. Like, there is no good religion. Like, let's just do away with all religion. Like, I don't know. Like, it seemed.
Yeah. Well, I think that I view religion in general as sort of a canary in the coal mine of a free society and free speech. Like the ability to believe something and to gather together with other believers. If you are in a society where they've said, no, you cannot do that based on a religious conviction, then that's a huge red flag that the society that you're in is already in that kind of tyrannical, totalitarian paradigm that is not a society that I would want to be in. So I would never want to say that all religions should be outlawed, or as maybe has been popularly said in some podcast, no one can ever claim to speak for God. That should be illegal. Because I think part of my journey was discovering what I felt like was a moral paradigm that was not rooted in religious authority. And, for me early on, that was kind of a natural rights, natural law philosophy that, philosophical libertarians may root their worldview in. But regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with whatever libertarianism is, because that has its own political dimension, it, at its philosophical basis, was a sort of moral framework that that then when you start to see the way that people are I guess engaging in censorship and a lot of the culture war stuff that we have right now, there's a lot of red flags that we're violating a lot of those principles, which were sort of ingrained in the type of free society that we had as an aspirational goal here in America and in what a lot of Western civilization was about. And I still think that those are honorable and lofty goals and principles. And so I'm very leery of abandoning them or demonizing them.
Right. Obviously there's like, I just listened to a debate last night on a channel called like Atheists for Liberty. And I'm just going to press you in the same way that this one guy was being pressed. I'm curious what you would say. Like, a lot of the people are like, well, it's okay to limit certain speech or whatever, because it's like, they'll basically say, well, you wouldn't necessarily just be like, yeah, all ideas are in the marketplace, right? The Overton window is wide open, because we do kick out like certain terrible ideas like anti-Semitism, all that stuff. So like this idea of um, pushing certain ideas out of this Overton window, like there hasn't really been states haven't been doing it too much. It's mostly like this social thing that's happening, right? And like voluntary self censorship and stuff. So like maybe people should be shamed for saying mean things to trans people, or I don't know, like you name,
Yeah.
take your pick of the thing that's in the culture war right
Yep.
now. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think to start with, there's the line between official government censorship that has some sort of force behind it. And so I agree with you that a lot of what we're seeing right now is more, it's not so much the state censorship, although we're seeing that there may have been an element of that in the way that the federal government has interfered with social media platforms in compelling them to reduce and diminish the signal of certain ideas and certain things. But that's a topic that you could spend a lot of time on.
Mm-hmm.
So apart from federal or government type of censorship, this question of what people are calling cancel culture, it's something that, if you start to criticize it, people say, well, no, these are the consequences of you saying bad ideas. And I think that the reality is that we are social creatures, and we, those consequences are going to exist for whatever reason. There is a notion about the reasons that you don't want government to censor things, but then there's also just on principle the reason that you want the freedom to be able to listen to other perspectives. And I think that is the principle that gets lost in these calls for censorship. So even if you don't agree with something, we can't all talk about every single thing at all forums. So there has to be a window of things that rise to the level of being brought into a discourse, and so at some point, some ideas are not going to be heard, and that's just the way that you have to organize the way that our discourse works. But
Mm-hmm.
to say that certain ideas should never be brought up, even when they may be relevant or they may be pertinent to a discussion, just de facto they shouldn't be brought up or can't be brought up. Or if they are brought up, a certain idea or a certain perspective immediately gets you blacklisted. I think that is an idea that, like a virus, can spread, and a society can adopt it, or certain people can adopt it, particularly when their desire to exclude ideas from a particular forum is motivated by ideological um, restrictions on that. These ideas are inherently wrong because of some dogma that I've accepted, and so we cannot give any platform or air to them. Well, I think that's the impulse that I would like to see more people push back against. And
Mm-hmm.
and so you can say, I disagree with these ideas. These ideas are deplorable. They're not worthy of public debate, and I'll tell you why. But that at that point is analyzing it. But then you also have to let the other person articulate why they think it should be, and then let kind of
The
the
chips
process.
fall where they
Yeah.
may.
And certainly, ideas that are bad, that lose favor, will have social consequences, and those will bear out in time. But I think even when there's people dealing with, like, the trans issue will frequently be polarizing. If you don't have the proper set of opinions on this issue, you will be labeled a bigot and deplatformed. Or anytime you try to poke your head up and say something, then people say, hey, aren't you the bigot who has these bad ideas? And so it's kind of a social ostracism sort of thing. But those are kind of lofty conceptual conversations that can happen when you have somebody in your life who is I guess steeped in those ideas, and you start to see how it maybe the level of discourse that's happening online that's vilifying people is totally removed from the real experience that your own child may be having as they go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that gets lost in this,
Yeah, for sure. Like I think the thing that bothers me when this is happening in public discourse is you'll have somebody be accused of one idea, and then they say, no, I don't believe that. I believe maybe this thing over here. And then the accusation is, well, that's just a dog whistle for this actual thing that you really believe over here. So they're telling you what you believe. And I actually see this happening um, with like I don't notice it as much anymore because I'm not like in the debate anymore. But when I first left the church, I would it really bothered me that people would assume what the other person believed. Um,
Hmm.
when they say I believe this, and they say no, you actually believe this. So it'd be like an ex-Mormon telling a Mormon, well, you actually believe this, or vice versa. Like it would be a Mormon saying, well, you left for this reason. Actually, I mean, you're saying you left because of this, but you actually left for this reason. And so I mean, I think that's just kind of like maybe a tribal thing, but that's probably the biggest irritation I have. But when you actually talk to people, it seems like you agree way more than you disagree.
Hmm.
Like I've noticed that I haven't been hanging around the three practice group very much, but that's where we would host these circles and different topics. And I'd have conversations like after hours with some of them, and they're all very left leaning, and I'm still quite conservative. And after just like talking to them, she's like, "Oh, well, so we don't really disagree that much," and it's like, "Nope."
Yeah.
So, anyways, but yeah, I don't know. That was one thought
No,
that I
I think some of those impulses are just kind of the normal way that humans engage with each other, knowing that there are those tribalism circuits, and there's
yeah,
also wanting to win an argument, and there's also the virtue signaling that is, when you're in a social environment where other people are watching you argue, well, there's things that you become motivated to do, and um, and I think things like perhaps the circle groups that you're talking about, other strategies that have been used to try to work against those impulses and focus a conversation to find those areas of agreement, or at least not to inflame the areas of disagreement, but to be more constructive, have been helpful for me to process and to kind of understand. So certainly, How to Have Impossible Conversations by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay was an important book for me. I did a series of kind of general conference talks, undue influence in general conference, where Luna Lindsay Corbden and I would listen to a talk and point out the aspects of undue influence were in it. And I think this was very, very early in my video journey. And I was very eager at that point to be really critical and to only be critical. And Luna kind of modeled for me giving them space to find goodness in what they do and what they believe, and the benefit of the doubt. And it was really helpful for me to not go down the angry apostate, the church is all bad, there's no good in it sort of pathway. And I think having that moderating perspective early on in my journey was helpful for me to continue to look for making sure that I don't turn into a demon something that is not completely demonic. And I think the work that Peter Boghossian has been doing with what he is calling spectrum epistemology is really instructive. And one of my side projects is to try to find an online way to engage with topics using that sort of paradigm,
mm,
where you ask people to kind of just give a degree of confidence with which they feel on a particular issue, and then just use that as a framework for digging into why somebody feels or why somebody believes a certain thing, and whether or not there's anything that might convince them to change the strength of their confidence in that belief one way or the other. And that type of discussion or debate, it's not really a debate as much as it is as an epistemological exploration of why do you believe this particular
mm.
thing. I think that
That'd be
that's
cool.
really helpful to gain insight. And so I've tried to shape a lot of the discussions that I have around that, I guess, that sentiment.
That's really cool. I think that would be cool. I've seen Read Nicewander try to do an online version before. I don't think it really took off. They do all kinds of experimenting with like street epistemology in general. Um, yeah, that's interesting. I want I've wanted to bring those three practice circles to more people. And I feel like people are unwilling to like register and like show up to a
Mhm.
Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get a few here and there that will pop in, and most people like it. But I was like, I wonder if there's a way to do that publicly so it can be seen and then people know what it is, and that way it's more advertised so they're not scared to click on a link and
Mm.
register. I don't know. I also kind of I got a little, I wouldn't say I got burnt out. We had some health issues in our family that I took a break from it and I just haven't gotten back on.
Hmm.
But um I don't know. That's still like near and dear to my heart. I think it's a really good model. And it's what's interesting to me is I had this view of people on the left were not for that kind of discussion because in my head, people on the left wouldn't talk to people on the right, and people on the left are trying to um, like censor free speech. All of these things that I do feel like there's a small minority trying to do. But when I engaged with those, what I found is that the more open people are the ones that are willing to be there, which also tend to be on the left. So it was always one sided. There's always people on the left, and then people on like with more conservative views. I think they felt outnumbered, and so they maybe didn't return to for that reason. So, but I would love to like have stuff like that where it was more balanced on both sides. I also did some ex-Mormon ones with David Osler. He was trying to get something going there. But the problem there was that it was always super sympathetic to the ex-Mormon side, but not really to traditional Mormon beliefs, which
Yeah.
obviously, why is someone going to come participate if they're just going to get bagged on the whole time? So,
Yeah.
um, so that kind of fell apart too. But um, anyways, I have that sentiment too that it would be fun to be able to like give people practice so they can use it in their real life.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, that's kind of one of the things that I think Brett Weinstein tweeted recently, that when you go into the world of evolutionary psychology, and you start to realize that it was just with evolutionary biology, they're both part of the evolution of the human species. Religion is an evolutionary factor. It is just as much a part of the evolution of the human species as other psychological things. And so that um that it makes it harder just to paint it as all bad. And I think it was really transformative for me to shift away from the factual, logical analysis of the church and into that evolutionary psychology perspective of the church. And that was probably the most mind-blowing thing, because it's kind of like, most easily stated, you could say, well, the Dumbo feather metaphor, the Dumbo's feather was a lie. But what it did is it helped him focus his own confidence, his own energy, his own abilities, and it caused him to do more and be more because of that lie. And even when he discovered it was a lie, he had the benefit of that. And so seeing how there's some aspects of religion, which, even if the justifications for some of the ways that it shapes your life, whether it's your beliefs, your values, your principles, some of those justifications may be based on a lie, but the justification itself has a ripple effect in your life. And it also has a ripple effect in the cohesion of your family and in the transmission of whatever it is that is your family into the next generation, and the replication of the values and the progress and the prosperity that you have. Like, all of those things are encoded somehow in how um, whatever the collection of values and principles that are embodied in a particular religion has. And so you can look at religions that grew in a flash in a pan, had crazy outrageous values and principles and things that they added into an individual's life. And if it did not do a good job of increasing the stability and the prosperity and the intergenerational transmission in that group, then it disappeared, and it did not stand this test of time. So you could think of Heaven's Gate, that it was not an intergenerational religion, because they killed themselves. And then if you just compare Mormons versus Jehovah's Witnesses, well, Jehovah's Witnesses also have a focus on family, and that's good, but they don't have that focus on education. And so the average, prosperity that a family is going to accumulate and then have that be a source of step up for the next generation is not as strong as in Mormonism, which places a very strong emphasis on education. And then you can contrast that with Scientology, where they consider the kids to be like their noise, and they disincentivize people who are in their priestly ranks from having children because that detracts them from stuff. And so that poses a challenge to the intergenerational transmission of that particular belief system. And I think just looking at coming to this realization made me re-examine Mormonism, say, well, okay, well, hold on a second. Other than the fact that a lot of the justification for some of the things in Mormonism is rooted in false claims and lies, there's something that it conveys to its members that I can look at from a secular perspective and understand there's some value there. And so you could even, so anything that we as Mormons could take and criticize. So, baptism at age 8, well, a person at age 8 doesn't really have the mental capacity to understand right and wrong in these complex sort of situations. And it's really coercive and manipulative to get them to make a commitment for the rest of their life at age 8. And so you can go on and on about how problematic it is. But you could also say, well, wait a second. What we're doing is we're saying at an early age, we're having a conversation with a kid and we're introducing the idea that they are responsible for their actions, and some of their actions can have negative consequences and some can have positive consequences, and that they need to start thinking about that at a young age. And there's something, I think, important about having some reason, some time where you have that conversation with the kid. Mm-hmm. And so you can look at almost all the different parts of the culture of Mormonism that may be justified by some religious decree, some scripture somewhere or something, and try to say, well, wait a second, what is the practical benefit that this particular thing has? And certainly not all of them are going to have practical benefits. Some of them may actually not have much of value, and so you wouldn't want to abandon it, you wouldn't want to hold on to it. But I think there's some things that you might actually be the baby with the bathwater that you don't want to throw out. And so I guess that was an aside about the whole evolutionary perspective of the church and how it maybe may cause you to look at it in a slightly different light.
Yeah, no, that's good. I was thinking about, I talk about this podcast that Jordan Peterson had with Sam Harris, because it was a pretty pivotal time for me, because that's the first time I ever realized, like, I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in like supernatural stuff, and I never like looked at Joseph Smith while I was thinking about that at the same time until during that podcast. I don't know if they talked about Mormonism or something that sparked it, but whatever it was, that I was on a run and I was listening to that podcast, and that was a painful podcast, but it was kind of talking a little, it's related, maybe you won't think so, but they're talking about truth the whole time. I don't know if you're familiar, if you ever.
Oh no, I absolutely believe that it's related. And this moment that you're describing, that was a huge mind-blowing moment for me, because I also felt like it was a really frustrating, annoying podcast. Why wouldn't this Jordan Peterson person just get to the point and concede about truth? Because objective reality and truth is what we are interested in. That's all we need to know.
Yeah.
And I think that if you are open enough to consider the importance of that conversation and the implications of it and where things have gone in our society since then, I think it's pretty important.
Right.
I want to hear what crossed through your mind while you were jogging.
Well, so I've brought this up in other places because that's the point when I was like, oh, is Joseph Smith really, like, did he do what he said he did? And I was like, actually, I don't think I believe that. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And it didn't mean anything for 3 more years. So anyway, moving on. The thing I was gonna really talk about was just how, like, you were talking about how it's like evolutionary true, it's evolutionarily true. I don't know if that's even a word. Okay, so it's true because it survives, right? It's pragmatically true, and that's how.
Well, I guess I want to have a caveat. I think the fact that we're using the word true in those two different domains is causing more of a problem. Like, I think it's good to
Yes.
use the word truth for objective, testable things that can stand falsification challenges, and you can talk about true in that realm. And I think when we're talking about evolutionary things, when you use the same word in that domain that you're using in the other, you're introducing a problem. Like, if you
Oh,
just had
for
a different
sure.
word that you used to talk about these other things, then there would be no reason for them to have an 8-hour discussion about the definition of truth.
That's fair. I guess the it's hard to articulate the thought. So I guess I feel like you were kind of talking about how, like, I wonder if there's unarticulate, like, you can't articulate the truths that you pass down with religion. Like, you can't. And there's this idea. This is a Jordan Peterson idea where before you can actually say kind of act it out, and before you act it out, like, you think it or whatever, like, there's this like progression of before you can actually articulate a thought, because that's actually pretty far down from the the thing, whatever it is.
Right, right.
um and so, like, maybe there's these real things that are true that it's like beyond our conscious comprehension, kind of idea. um and I don't know, I guess that's where I have like a lot of humility when it comes to feeling like whether I'm actually definitely on the right path. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I feel like I'm progressing in my life, and that feels a lot better than being stuck. So I'm I'm okay with it. But I definitely, it was really hard. Let me change subject just slightly. It was really hard for me for a while to give grace to my family that still believed in Mormonism when it was so obviously wrong. And I've really honestly got to a point where I can't honestly participate in Mormonism, but I am not sure I'm honestly like the one that's on the right path, if that makes sense. Like, um, whether I'm on the more wise path, I don't know how else to put it, but um, yeah, I have some skepticism, I guess, of the nun path because I'm not sure it goes anywhere.
Yeah.
So, anyways,
Well, I think what I started to do to reconcile a lot of this is to step back and realize that, kind of in separating the objective claims of truth from what people have called pragmatic truth or useful truth, or just
mhm,
things that convey some form of advantage, whether it's an advantage in helping a human mind come to terms with the chaos and the tragedy and the difficulties of life, or whether it's a truth that helps a family stay together and to weather the storms, or whether it's a truth that helps a society stay cohesive and deal with all of the different challenges that a society has at all those different levels. But what I started to see is that I could look at Mormonism as a collection of values in addition to the claims. And if you talk to a believing member, they have a bunch of values, and those values are justified by the claims, the truth claims. And when I talk with my brother, I realize that I have pretty much the same values that he does. There's a few differences here and there. It's just the same values. Now, I believe those values are worthwhile and good, not because some prophet said that an angel appeared and declared it unto him, but because I think there's an actual benefit to holding to those values, and those benefits are near and dear to my heart, and I believe are effective in the navigation of a life that optimally produces happiness and prosperity and stability. I've started to see stability as like a really important value that I did not understand was so important when I was younger, but it really is. And so I see, Mormons in that believing frame are very, very similar to me in terms of values. I can feel comfortable being in a group of Mormons because I understand what their values are, and they're within a frame that I am familiar with and comfortable with. And whether or not those values are justified by wackadoo claims that are easily debunkable, or you can see the problems, is not that important. The important part is the values. And I think this becomes particularly important when you go and you it's an adventure to go and explore different secular communities afterwards, after you leave Mormonism. And it may be that there was a time in America where society was so homogeneous that you saw various different, expressions of what were traditionally Protestant beliefs or Judeo-Christian beliefs. But now the realm of beliefs and the realm of values that are out there are so varied, and in some cases so opposed to what I may have as a value. And it's not that they're opposed in a live and let live framework, but they're opposed in a paradigm of you're a bad person if you don't also have these same values that we have. And you know, it's you're okay with navigating that by yourself, but when you think about, well, how are you going to bring up children in that environment? How are you going to allow the children themselves to integrate their own identities and to navigate the different milestones that it takes to get to adulthood and to maintain a stable, cohesive sense of identity and a purpose and meaning in life? And there are challenges if you don't have the structure that a religion has. It doesn't mean that it's impossible.
Hmm.
It just I guess your community then is a little bit more fractured, because it's harder to do those things with a community that has so many values that take you in different directions. And so I think part of the evolutionary advantage of religious paradigms is the community dimension of it. And that community dimension of it helps an individual or a family within the community unit as a whole to navigate challenges and overcome hardships. And that is something that it really, I mean, John Dehlin has talked about this a few times. Religion does community good well when it's done in a healthy paradigm. And it just, the secular communities do not, they try and they generally don't. I mean,
It's
and
like the three practice thing I just described.
yeah. And,
Yeah.
and people fall apart. And so you say, wait a second, is it that you have to kind of have some of these culty things in order to
To even
get people to
survive.
wake up on
You
Sunday
have to
and
have
to
some
keep going?
dogma to hold you together.
Yeah.
Hmm. I I was thinking about, I'm not sure churches save you from this like cultural thing that you're talking about. Like I'm pretty sure like the churches get hijacked by the government ideology just as well as anything else. And it like am I wrong? I'm pretty sure like in Germany the churches didn't stop any of the bad things from happening. And I don't know, maybe they did away with churches in some of, I think Russia was probably, they just did away with churches, didn't they?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if churches are going to save you from that kind of
Well, I mean,
high
churches are
level
not all the
thing.
same. I
Yeah.
I think that
And it seems
anytime you talk
like,
with people about religion or churches, then it becomes tempting to just talk about them in block. But just like there's differences in any organization, how they conduct themselves, how they
yeah,
may, the in speaking of stability being an important factor, then that when you see that, then it becomes important, I think, for you to look at historically. Hesitance to change is not always a bad thing. Like there's some things where there's some flash in the pan social movements that may get a lot of noise and a lot of attention, but carry with them a dissolving of some of the important principles that hold something together. And so, you know, like you could just look back at the hippie movement and free love and all of the different things that went along with that. And it was important at the time. It got a lot of press at the time. It felt liberating at the time. But those things and a lifestyle built on those things wasn't really looking for intergenerational cohesion and stability in it. And we're seeing today things like polyamory have become socially relevant and popular, and even touted as perhaps a higher form of love or a more ethical form of love. And so if a church's boundaries are so loose that they immediately adopt any social movement that comes on, they may actually be shooting themselves in the foot. And that's not to say, that the other end of that is a group that never changes. and that carries its own problems as well. So I think Mormonism is in between those two extremes. It's probably in the hesitant to change um, end of things, but it's still, as you say, it gets influenced by government. Why do we have Mormon church leaders interfacing with the United Nations in a way that seems antithetical to its
Yeah.
founding ideas?
Yeah. Well, that kind of is a good segue. Like I've kind of I've seen, it seems like politics are like the new, I mean, you can define religion a lot of ways, and obviously you could define politics as a religion in a pretty loose sense, but it seems like it's like the most important religion in people's lives. Like even, and this is probably a really good example, like it seems like I could get along with Jacob Hansen probably better than uh
Self on the
like,
shelf.
well, yeah, like as a friend, like if we were to hang out, that's not totally true. I've got a lot of woke friends and we hang out and we're fine. So I probably get along with them just fine because you just don't talk about what you disagree with.
Well, I was about to say,
That's
do
generally
you
what, no, no. Actually
see? I think
with one friend
this
I
points
do.
out a difference that's
No,
important, though.
with one friend I do, and it's pretty mild. But every once in a while, when we go to lunch and it's just us, we will. But like if we're with everybody, then we don't talk about politics. So, um, yeah, it's interesting. I I'm outside the mainstream idea. I'm like a conspiracy theorist. You are too, if you are saying that Peter Boghossian and his James Lindsay, his friend, are decent people to listen to.
That's
Podcast
mainstream online. I think there's such a significant
mainstream
divide between what is
mainstream public
mainstream
opinion.
in mainstream and online and among elite intelligentsia academic circles, and then
Who
there's,
run everything.
yeah,
So
but
now I'm a conspiracy theorist. I was listening to a podcast, Decoding the Gurus, and their favorite people to decode are all of the contrarian thinkers. So they'll take little pieces of what somebody has said, and then they'll just talk about how bad it is and how problematic it is. And in
mhm,
their big bad wolf is like if anybody kind of sounds a little contrarian, they're attacking like Jordan Peterson, who they wouldn't consider, I don't think, center, which is
no,
what's really weird. So
he's far
they'll,
right.
yeah, yeah, like so that's what's really weird. Although I have been
Well,
curious about Jordan Peterson lately. I'm not on Twitter a lot, and he's been talking in these like poems, and I don't get it. So
I I, I don't follow him religiously. I agree with a lot of things that I've seen him talk about, and
yeah,
I think
he just gets a little too
there's
passionate.
stuff. Well, yeah, I think him and a few other people that defend religion, I'm there for some of the defenses, but there's no, it seems like this whole thing where it's almost like they're saying religion is good without seeing that no, there's definitely some problems that show up in these religious groups. And
Well, and it
you
could
can't
be.
just,
Sorry, go ahead.
no,
I'll let you
no,
finish.
I lost my thread.
Sorry. So, and I was just gonna say, like, it could be that, like, in broad society, maybe we have a lack of like religiosity, but certainly in bubbles, you're gonna have problems with fundamentalism. You know what I mean? So it's
Mhm.
so weird to break out of a bubble of fundamentalism and like step out into a world that is probably a little aimless, I guess, like
Mhm.
it I
Well,
feel
that's where
like
that,
consumerism and all that stuff, the stuff that the left doesn't like either, by the way, like
mhm.
this, you know, capitalism, they'll blame on capitalism, but I don't know, like yeah, so anyway, there's definitely
Well, what do you see the landscape? Because you're describing the wider social landscape, and I think viewers of my channel will realize that I went in a different direction than a lot of the ex-Mormons will. So, what is your take on the landscape of it? Because it does seem like once you lose the moral framework of Mormonism, then you still have a need for feeling that you're a good person. And there's a great secular moral framework for you to immediately adopt, which is that critical social justice perspective. And so if you immediately adopt it tells you who's good, who's bad, what are the good ideas, what are the bad ideas. And then you can immediately look at the world in judgment, look at yourself and make sure that you're one of the good people. And it gives you now this what is essentially a religious moral framework. It's just that rather than a divine religion, it's this critical social justice religion. And I think a lot of people accept it on face value without exploring the philosophical underpinnings and history of that movement and those ideas and those ways of framing reality and society. And so it just seems right. And that's where a lot of ex-Mormons went. And I've like to think that I've kind of said, no, there needs to be another voice here, another perspective on it, because you're not getting it from Mormon stories. I mean, that is so clearly, I mean, from John Larson, who's just saying, I'm an avowed socialist,
Mm-hmm.
to Zelf on the Shelf, who I always have a soft part of my heart for them because, they were kind of came out a little bit after I did, and, were way more successful than I was. And they were one of the few people that actually stood up for me in the whole apology debacle of
Mm.
2015 or whatever. So as much as I disagree with some of the direction and the things that they have, I still see them. They've changed and evolved over time, and maybe there's growth and room for them to continue doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's very little in terms of conservative or non super progressive
Yeah.
ex-Mormon voices out there.
I was shocked because I thought it was common knowledge, like what what I was believing about the woke stuff. So I was actually shocked that when I kind of became more familiar with what was going on in the ex-Mormon space, that everyone was falling for it. And I think it's just kind of like a natural progression. Like I don't think people realize what they're adopting when I think they just have really big hearts. They have a lot of empathy, they have a lot of caring, and it certainly looks a lot opposite of church. And so it's like, well, the church said this was bad, and then they realize, well, that's not bad. And then what else isn't
Right.
bad?
Yeah.
Like it's pretty I don't blame anyone for going down that path at all.
Well, that's why it's so ironic that your quote would be that the atheist movement would benefit from critical social justice, because it was critical social justice that blew up the atheism 2.0 movement or atheism plus movement.
Yeah.
It was the inherently divisive social result of adopting that mindset of dividing everybody up into oppressors and oppressors based on intersectional identity categories, because no
Mhm.
society that is full of diverse people can exist if everybody's looking out for oppression and domination and victimhood based
Power.
on those different things. It's that's where, like, I think seeing how that mindset dissolves any type of social cohesion, studying the history of the how those ideas as they are expressed in Marxism resulted in Russia, and how they were transformed into Mao's philosophy and how it transformed China. Like, all those are very instructive, and they should remind you of, like, okay, so then a religion that does have some concepts can actually be cohesive rather than destructive. So, like, seeing humanity as all children of God is a unifying belief that
Mhm.
even if it's rooted in some divine claim, has the functional result of a basis for people to see humanity as a foundational identity that gives people a reason to come together. And then the principle of grace and forgiveness and redemption, those things weigh centrally pretty heavily in a lot of different religious paradigms, but they are woefully lacking in whatever it is that you know grows out of a foundation of critical social justice.
Mhm.
um, and so I think looking at the contrast between how a set of values and beliefs shapes a society that adopts it or a community that adopts it is an important dimension of kind of looking at, at where you go after you leave the church.
Yeah. I'm so I'm trying to decide. I want to ask you about your relationship with other public podcasters, but I am actually curious about it, but I'm not sure if you want to like say it publicly either. But
I think it's just I'm friendly with most of them,
right.
and we shoot messages to each other. I think
Mhm.
they know that I'm not quite on the same page with some things, and they've been cordial and nice to me. And I think it's,
Started a new thread without you, probably. Just kidding.
well, that could be, that very well
Just
could be.
joking.
But I think just like some of them have been open to exploring some of the ideas. I think a lot of them were surprised that I've confronted the trans issue as indirectly as I have.
Mhm.
Even though for me, I just look at it as like I've wanted to talk about it for a long time, but it's just been terrifying.
Mhm.
And so I finally found ways to do it. And I have my own story about why that issue was important to me.
Mhm.
And I think the phenomenon of detransitioners is a wave that is going to hopefully get a lot of people to re-examine their beliefs on that issue. Um, but
Do you know what's interesting about that is
what's that?
anytime I've heard that conference, like if there's when you bring up detransitioners to like someone that's trans and an activist, they'll say, well, that's only 1%. I'm like, yes, but that's the margins. That's the marginalized of your own little group. Don't you care
Yeah.
about your marginalized, the marginalized of the marginalized? And they don't give a crap.
Well,
And I
and
think
if you dig into, well, where did you get that 1% from? And you look at the way that studies are designed, data is collected, and look at the medical side of these things, which that's where I think that was my window into it, is I can examine the medical claims and look at that from an objective basis. And the discourse on that whole subject is so distorted by dogmatic ideological activists, both within the medical profession as well as influencing the medical profession, and certainly on social media. It's a very challenging issue, and it has like remarkable effects. If our generation was the young people were all being hippies and they were going out and having free love and drugs and everything, okay, well, a lot of those things, you go through that and you explore your identity and your personhood and what is right for you, and then you integrate your identity and you live your life. And there's, it was a bump in the road or a nexus in your journey. But
Mhm.
the way that the medicalization of this new identity exploration has the effect of irreversible surgical and hormonal changes, sterilization, um, where people cannot have kids coming on, lifelong medical consequences of having to dilate neovagina for the rest of their life, all of the pain and complications that go along with it, all these things that are diminished on the front end when young people are exposed to these ideas. Um, to be frank, I went through this journey coming out of Mormonism. I learned a lot about culty techniques. And then I had somebody very close to me talk about experiencing gender dysphoria and going through the journey of becoming trans. And I set out to understand. I wanted to understand. I wanted to support. I wanted to be an ally. I started reading books. I started looking at things, and the red flags about cultiness were going off the charts. But it's different because in a religion there's like a strong figure there. You can point to him. He's making claims. He's a narcissist, and he wants all the power. Well, this isn't like that. This is like different. It's not a cult of personality. It's like a cult of ideology and a cult of identity, and it's diffused over an entire social movement. But all of the things that you would identify in a cult in terms of information control, in terms of fear mongering, in terms of us versus them, elitism, like all these different things that we could point to a cult and say, this is why you are overriding the agency of the people who are under your thrall. Those are happening, but it's happening in a distributed way where rather than, one crab stomping everybody down, you have all the crabs pulling each other down. And when I started to see that, I was like, well, hold on a second. This is a problem, because there's, the idea is out there that, that ideology, somebody's ideas and beliefs could never do what gender dysphoria is doing. Nobody would ever want to, remove or change their genitals or their sexuality based on, beliefs that could be mistaken. But when you study Heaven's Gate, that's exactly what they did. They believed that their innate inner identity was a being that transcended humanity, and that this human sexuality was actually antithetical to the true essence. And so they wanted to become eunuchs, and they talked about this justification for eunuchs. You can go to the Heaven's Gate what YouTube channel and hear Marshall Applewhite talk about the rationality for removing your genitals because of a system of beliefs. And so beliefs do have the power to cause somebody to want to physically transform their body. And when you see that, and then you start to listen to detransitioners, I think Benjamin Boyce's channel, where he started just getting transition people who had gone down the trans pathway and then stepped away, talk about their journey, you start to see that dogma and ideology are rife throughout that, and it's influencing young children at the most vulnerable part of their lives, where their identity is in question. They're trying to differentiate themselves from their family. They're dealing with all of the anxiety and depression and other issues, and here's a ready set identity that gives them social clout. It gives them a social circle. It gives them validation, and it gives them celebration in peers, and they can frame it within the construct of gender dysphoria. And those beliefs and adopting those perspectives and that narrative do transform your mind. And so the experience of gender dysphoria that comes out of that is real. But there's an ideological dimension in at least some people, and it's probably a whole lot more than some, because when you look at the historical rates of this being a persistent problem, it's a very select and small population. Certainly nothing like the 1,000% growth that we've seen in the same population that gets affected by social contagion, whether it's cutting or suicide or eating disorders. It's that young women population, and it's the same population that's affected by it. And so I think going to and having my eyes opened to how that, the same things that I learned about how coercive religions can shape the worldview and the self-image of an individual, can operate in other non-religious domains. And certainly we could say, well, yeah, it happens in politics, right? All these Trump followers, you see him as their god. So it's, political things can be culty. Then you can study the communist movement in China. You can say, yeah, that's totally culty. As a matter of fact, like the whole reason that we can talk about cults and thought reform is because some guy went and studied what they did there. That was Robert Lifton, and he published a book about it, and that spawned the whole movement of sociologists trying to understand and psychologists trying to understand how coercive control and thought reform can shape an individual's conception of themselves in such that they would take actions for themselves that you would not conceive of that anyone would want to do for themselves. So I think that dimension of it gets lost, because if you want to talk about it, you are, there's ready-made thought-terminating cliches of, oh, it's just 1%. Oh, you're a bigot if you think that there's anything like that. Oh, you're talking about conversion therapy, and clearly that's bad. And so, you're one of the bad ones. And I think that's where I know that there are differences in position between myself and some of the other podcasters. There's, I think going on the journey that I went to, because it was important to me for people in my family and in my life. I think it's significant. And if I had not done that research, and if I had just said, okay, well, let's get you what you want right now, then looking at those same people today, how they identify today, the hopes and dreams that they have for themselves and their future today, I would have shut all of that off for them if I had gone down the hormonal and the surgical route at the time that that's what they were looking for. And so we went from a world where we were trying to convey to children that you're good enough the way you are, and that the way that we shape you into a healthy adult who has an integrated identity is we reaffirm that you're good enough, and that yes, there are challenges in life, but there are tools that you're equipped with that you can deal with it. Well, we've thrown that away, and now we're in the, well, there's something, that's a mismatch between who you are and what you are, and we're going to apply all of these things that just happen to benefit the same pharmaceutical and medical industry that we would criticize in any other domain. But we're going to go right down that pathway here. So
right.
I don't know of too many other ex-Mormon podcasters that have expressed any opinions one way or the other. Chris Hanna, I think, and his crew of unruly, problematic men, cis hetero white men,
They're
are,
probably they're white Christian nationalists. You can ignore
yeah,
them.
yeah. But I don't know. I think that that may make it harder, for example, for John DeLynn to ever have me on his show again.
Okay,
As
that was kind of what I wanted to bring up. You were on Bill Reel's channel the other day, and I don't know, Bill Reel is actually pretty open. Like he hasn't kicked me out, right? So
yeah,
so he is pretty open. He definitely believes what he believes, but I love how he has stayed true to that idea that his own ideas aren't the only ideas, I guess. Like
mhm.
I really like that about Bill. But no, I was dying a little bit inside because I knew like a lot of his listeners are going to be on the on that social justice activism train in some degree or another. At least if they're not on it, they're okay with it. And so anyway, I don't
Well,
understand
I
how
think
you
it's a
survive.
thing
Maybe you
now.
won't survive after this if I publish it. Maybe I shouldn't.
Oh, no, I think your audience probably is in the right frame of mind for it. But I think it's an expected
Yeah.
thing now. If I ever do show up on Bill's channel or John DeLynn for whatever reason, then I'm going to get in the live stream. There's going to be like, oh, he's a transphobe, he's a bigot. Like I already get that,
Mm.
and then oh, this is the guy that did the racist apology. Um, you know,
So you haven't lived
f
down
that
off of
guy.
that one.
No, no, no. That's I'm deep in the cultural memory for that one among certain
Oh. See, that was
segments of
before my
people.
time, so I guess I didn't feel the full gravity of that. I'm sure you did though.
Yeah, it was my first cancellation experience. It was my only cancellation experience, really. So
So
it
now,
was an interesting thing to go through.
huh.
And here I
Well,
am. I still talk, so I wasn't
yeah.
canceled totally. But it
Right.
was stressful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been an hour.
All right.
I really appreciate it. Well,
Sure.
it's been more than an hour.
Well, I think we got started just a little bit late, but
Okay.
all right. Well,
Well,
it's great having a chat.
yeah. Thanks for coming on. I'm glad we could finally line it up. And
Yeah.
is there anything you're excited about that you're working on? Are you going to publish anything on your channel? Anything
Let's see.
upcoming?
I am a terrible organizer, and so I start the ball rolling on different projects, and I think of different ideas, and then I do a bunch of research on them, and then I just never finish them. So I have like a butt ton of stuff like that, and I get distracted.
Like
I
with
started
this
to
kind of stuff.
focus. Yeah, well, I started focusing on family stuff and kid priorities, and I got married earlier this year, and so I just have so much more in my life that I enjoy doing, and people enjoy spending time with. That it's there's smaller and smaller windows to do stuff online, but I don't I'm having fun with artificial intelligence and image creation and voice cloning, and there might be some fun projects coming out with that, kind of in
Yeah.
the humorous realm of things.
Well, I love that. I actually had a listener send me an email and said, I single handedly brought him back into the Mormon space. I'm like, no, that's not what I want to do. Because I feel like it's a good thing to move on and like pay more attention to your life. I don't know. There's this part of me that I would love for like Cardin Ellis and John DeLynn to hang out together. They're both really tall guys. I think they'd really get along. Like, it really bothers me how much animosity that is like there are things my knee jerk reaction. I think I get more knee jerk reactions from the woke stuff. I really do. Like that's my knee jerk reaction. It bugs me. Um, but at the same time, like it just takes me 5 seconds to realize, oh, that's where they're at, and they think that's good. Oh, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. I don't know.
What's that?
Do you have another 15 minutes? I
We can
really
make
did.
it quick.
Okay. So there's this idea like good versus evil. Like, is there really evil? Like, are evil people when they're doing their thing, like that I consider evil, are they just doing what they think is right? Does that make sense? Do people in their mind know they're doing evil things and then do it anyway? Does that make sense?
I think that
What do you think on that?
I think for the most part, for most people, they see themselves as the hero. They have a set of principles that they are acting under the guidance of, and they believe they're doing right. And I will give people the benefit of the doubt for that.
Yeah.
That being said, there's a whole profession of psychology that has identified that there are personalities that for whom social rules and good versus evil means less than I do what I want to do, and that can be at the expense of other people's lives, other people's interests,
Mm,
and any guilt or shame that I have just does not compute in it. And there are pathologic personalities that will conduct themselves that way, and I've heard people cite that reality as a reason to say, well, we're not there's no free will because it's just those people have the chemicals in their brain and they choose that, and there's no objective morality anyway. And so we
mhm,
should just, I think that abandoning morality itself, or abandoning the idea that there are behaviors which are good and behaviors which are bad and behaviors which should be prohibited, is not the direction we want to go as a society. I think that there's still an important dimension to that, and so what do you root that in? And I think just from a game theory perspective, and I think that the whole golden rule concept or non-aggression concept is a decent starting point to try to build things from,
mhm.
where you maximize freedom, but that freedom ends where one individual's action affects harm on another individual. And people have talked about the limitations of that, and that's fine. It's just that most other ways that you would set up those moral frameworks also have their limitations. So then you can compare the limitations.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at, like, I think there's a lot of people that would look at what John Delen's doing and they think he's actually evil, right? And I'm looking at him and I was like, and Bill Real, and I look at them and I believe them when they say, I think this is important and I'm going to do this thing because I think it's going to help people.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so
No,
so
yeah.
the, so the problem that I'm having, and like, am I giving too much grace? Like, should I hold people accountable? Like even Tim Ballard with this Tim Ballard stuff, he probably justified whatever he was doing if he's actually guilty of the accusations, all the accusations that are being lobbed at him right now. My guess is that in some way he probably justified it in his head, and in his head he was still the hero in his story. It's not like he was even Joseph Smith. Like all, it's not it's not to say that there isn't actually bad. Like I think those things are bad. I'm having a hard time. It's really hard for me to get my head around somebody that actually thinks they're doing something terrible and they know it. And I don't know, but
Yeah.
maybe.
Well, I mean, and in those cases, it seems like there's obvious motivations for people: sex, power, money, influence. And when somebody's use of deception or some of the cult manipulative things in terms of putting some lofty ideal out there and then using that as a justification for behaviors that somebody would not otherwise choose to do, like all of those things are part of whatever is coming out in Tim Ballard. And so those are methods of manipulation and motives for manipulation that I think you can't ignore in
Mhm.
that. You did bring up an important part in terms of our John Dehlin and Bill Real doing, and I think they're doing what they believe to be good, but they're also doing what they believe to be in their best interest, and they've made a career out of what they're doing. And so, whether or not a video gets clicks, whether or not the audience reaction is big or not, become a factor in what they choose to cover, how they choose to cover it. And I believe there is a influence in that that is a problem and is a potential for them to go off the deep end in certain directions. And right now, when you have to virtue signal certain things, you have to platform certain things, I think that they are subject certainly to those types of influences. And I it's kind of like when you see a journalist that you've respected in the past start to become very ideologically oriented and to embrace their biases rather than try to overcome it. I feel like this is a pathway that they run the risk of going down.
Mhm.
And I hate to see that be an unchecked sort of thing. So I just think there's a problem as soon as you monetize this, because we're talking about things that tend to have a moral dimension to it. Then both of them have to be the right, good type of person, and whatever determines what good is tends to be this critical social justice thing. And so that's just going to be a distorting factor, because they have to be willing to go against the grain, willing to say things that might offend their audience. And when you hear the pleas for money, oh, we lost subscribers, we've had a lot of subscribers lost, and the pleas for money in that regard, I think that's just a reminder that there is a dimension of what they do that may introduce a bias that they themselves may not be aware of. There's this great Key and Peele video where they're doing a stage play of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and there's an audience there, and they take turns saying lines, and some of the audience doesn't respond good to one person, and so another person says something different, and the audience responds positively to it. So he says something even more in that direction, and the audience responds positively to it. And it's just a brilliant depiction of audience capture and how it can actually shape the way that a public figure talks and what they talk about and how they talk about it. And that's something that I don't know if those guys look out for. I've sent them the link to these things, and I've said, hey, this is something we need to make sure that we're all paying attention to. But I don't monetize. I'm not basing my income, my livelihood. I didn't retire from a job so that I could do this full time, like I know Radio Free Mormon and Bill Reel have done. And so that just places a different kind of emphasis on what they cover and how they cover. They do a lot of good work, and I totally enjoy all the time, all the chatting I spend with them, and so I hope that they remind themselves regularly, to keep an even keel in that regard.
Yeah. I've been interviewing different podcasters, and a lot of times I will ask them about, like, do you worry about audience capture? And I ask them that question, and it's interesting to hear. I think I even asked Bill Reel that question, and just how he's been driven by money. I think he responded, if I remember right, that he has a lot of projects that like nobody listens to, that he feels would be helpful to people. And so yeah, but I don't know, like I can't remember for sure. I'd have to go back and listen. Anyways, yeah, I wonder about the same thing, and that's why I'm okay that I have no listeners.
Well, the other thing is, like, all of us are just kind of, there is going to be a point where we realize, I think, that we do need to step offline and touch grass and engage with people personally and do that. And I've been trying to allow myself to be influenced more by the people in my life that are reminding me about that.
Yeah,
and so
for
that's
sure.
been an important thing.
Yeah, same. So, all right. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Okay.
And I'll let you go.
All right. Take care. It's been great.
Yep. Thanks.
Bye now.